Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning. Welcome to Next Landscapes conference. It's a two-day online conference focused mainly on landscape architecture, its present and its future. We will talk about connection of city and nature and landscape at all. Conference starts today. We are heading to 3 sessions of lectures and discussions. We will start with some context. We will focus on urban and digital landscapes, and we will show you some positive urban design case studies. You have a chance to ask us a question. You can join a chat via the same app that you are watching this video, so you can ask us a question, you can join the discussion that will follow after the lectures. Now, at the beginning, let me start the conference with few words of Mayor of Prague, Zdeněk Hřib, and Deputy Mayor Petr Hlubuček.
I'm happy to open this first year of the International Conference for Landscape Architecture, Next Landscapes 2021. Landscape architecture is in the Czech context an underappreciated field. And I'm aware of the widely held perception that landscape architects are just making gardens or parks. And this conference is an opportunity to show how very important this area it can be to respond and offer solutions to current global changes and challenges, such as global warming, lack of water, soil degradation, and changes in the way public space is used after COVID. I wish all attendees, landscape architects and officials, inspirational lectures and interdisciplinary discussions. A big thank you goes to IPR and other partners for organizing this conference as a further step towards greener Prague. I hope to meet you in person at the next year's event.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to first year of International Conference of Landscape Architecture called Next Landscapes. The overall topic of the conference is the adaptation to the climate change, which is one of the main topics of our climate policy I'm currently in charge of. The City of Prague has adopted 2 strategic documents regarding climate. Climate Plan of City of Prague by 2030, approved in May 2021, and Climate Change Adaptation Strategy of the City of Prague, approved in 2018. The fundamental idea of the adaptation is based on the appropriate measurements, helping to reduce the heat island effect, improve the microclimate, and generally contributes to the inner city cool down by effective rainwater management. Therefore, we are taking action and effort to push forward projects such as planting new trees and greenery in general, creating new parks and forests, revitalizing water streams and ponds, or establishing new water areas. We also managed to improve conditions for agriculture in Prague to be more suitable for organic farming. And recently we developed new rules called standards for rainwater management and the maintenance of trees in the city. Some positive examples include projects such as the revitalization of a city-scale urban park Stromovka, the establishment of the landscape park Vladech, including the revitalization of water ponds, the field Plužiny, which is a great example of organic farming, and last but not least, the revitalization of the urban stream called Rokitka. The projects in Prague and also in the Czech Republic are often connected to the complicated procedures of coordination. We have to deal with various interests, often resulting in disputes between the technical infrastructure, the nature conservation, and the public requirements, which prolong the whole process of preparation and implementation. Here I perceive the important role of landscape architecture, which can connect all the fields and approach and offer complex solutions based on a consensual approach. Therefore, I'm glad that Prague has established a new international platform for sharing the best practice. I truly believe that today's discussion will rewarding experience for all of you and provide inspiration for solving everyday issues when implementing climate change adaptation projects.
Thank you, gentlemen. And let me thank you to our partners, which are Společnost pro zahradní a krajinářskou tvorbu, Czech Association for Landscape Architecture, International Federation of Landscape Architects, Czech Chamber of Architects, and Faculty of Architecture of Czech Technical University in Prague. My name is Jiří Jaroš, and I will be the host for this conference, but I won't be alone. I will be here with my colleague Martina Imramovská. She's practicing landscape architect and founder of M12 Atelier, and she will put you in context, put the context of the conference in context of Czech landscape architecture and European landscape architecture. Please welcome.
Many people perceive landscape as nature, especially in Czech Republic. Landscape architecture is considered to be green, lush, nice to look at, and usually placed outside of the buildings in the surrounding leftover area. It is seen as something nice to have. Even more often, people think of landscape architecture as a field operating outside the cities in an open rural landscape area, very closely connected with agriculture, forestry, and food production. All of these are true to some point, although landscape architecture goes far beyond these misconceptions. The word landscape was firstly used in 1598 as an artistic expression to describe the view scenery on the painting. It comes from Dutch word landschap and literally means condition of the region or an area. Based on European Landscape Convention, landscape is an area perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and human factors. And that human factor is what distinguishes landscape from nature. Human perception is the crucial aspect that forms our landscape and performs interaction within. Landscape architecture is a very young professional field. Although some say that it started thousands of years ago when our ancestors started to settle down and form first roots between the shelter, water, and food sources. Some say it was a human search for lost paradise on earth, or that it is an art as old as humankind. The term landscape architect was first used by Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park in New York in 1863. First course was opened at Harvard University in 1901, followed by university in Pennsylvania, Norway, Germany, and so on. The American Society of Landscape Architects was founded in 1899. Another international society, International Federation of Landscape Architects, appeared in 1948, followed by many other professional groups. In Czech Republic, landscape architecture was long perceived as the art of gardens, horticulture, and rural development. First study program called Landscape Architecture started in 2001 at Mendel University in Lednice, followed by Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague in 2008, and Czech Technical University in Prague in 2015. Current situation is getting better year after year. There are some professional online groups opening discussions and serving as a think tank. Czech Chamber of Architects has a group for landscape architecture since 2008. Landscape Festival started in 2014 and take place each year in different locations. There are new competitions, new projects are appearing, new dialogues are opening. Landscape architecture is slowly becoming a very important field, cooperating with other planning fields, serving current needs, and solving contemporary issues. It still has its struggles. We are still learning how to work together, how to talk to each other, how to communicate our professional needs, and how to cooperate to ensure the best result possible. This conference is the evidence of opening towards the other planning institutions, sites and voices, and I'm very glad that we can all be part of it. So thank you once again for being part of it, and welcome to Next Landscapes 2021.
Martina will join us again for the discussion after the first session, and the session starts with theologian and biologist Marek Orkovácha from Charles University. Welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning, Marek, and please, now you have your 20 minutes.
So thank you very much.
Has two sorts of values. Of course, we live out of the land. We use it as a resource for our food, for our clothing. We build our houses on it. So we live not only on the land, but also from the land. But at the same time, we perceive the beauty of the country, of the landscape. For Christianity, the land takes us to heaven. And we will see further on that for the mystics, for priests, for theologians, the land is a sort of a picture through which we can see the beauty of the painter, or like a statue through which I can see the beauty of the sculptor. If you look at those four pictures, I would like to remind you of a not very well-known essay by a Dutch philosopher, Jonas, who says that the history of mankind can be divided into 3 steps. The first step is called by him the animistic step. He defines animism, of course, this is the universe, so animism is defined as not making a difference between persons and things. And it does not make a difference between the living and the non-living, and between the spiritual and material. So this black circle circles the whole of the universe.
Quote Hans Jonas, for this universe, being is being alive. There is no death. Everything is alive. Yeah? Not only animals and plants, but all the trees, all the landscape, even the sun and the moon and the stars. Everything is alive. Strictly speaking, there is no everything. Everything is everybody. Yeah? There is no English it, just he or she. Everything is alive. So the problem of animism is problem with death. We don't know what exactly death is, because being is being alive. Yeah? And this is, well, I will switch to Czech language. Yeah?
And this is the world of small children.
Is the globe to koule.
For them, the sun, for us, the sun is just a ball of helium and hydrogen. But for children, it is something that's alive, that you can wave to, that you can talk to. Mushrooms, yes, okay, we can, even us, we can say that the mushrooms are alive, but for the children also, the train, the bridge pillars, everything is alive. And that's animism. And here you can see a sign in a tram in Brno, and it has a name. It's called Maruška, so it's alive.
Man of science říká nám, že máme všichni stejné.
He tells us that our eyes are the same, but the minds that are behind those eyes are different. You can have a look at the flags of Argentina and Uruguay, and you can ask what they see in the sky. Me, as a European, I can see a ball of helium, of hot vapors. But for the Uruguayans, for example, it is alive. Or let's have a look at René Descartes. He says that the world is matter, res extensa, and only for people it is a res cogitans, thinking thing. So we have matter that's endowed with reason, and then matter that is not endowed with reason. For Descartes, it's the animal machine. So animals are animals, machines. So for Descartes, they are basically dead. They're just mechanic things. They are an assembly of wheels and mechanisms, like a doll. So for Descartes, both animals and plants were things. And this is exactly how the 17th century treated animals, because people thought they cannot feel pain, so they dissected them alive. Another interesting thing is that Galileo Galilei or René Descartes tried to look at the world in a way that they can only be measured. So this is the methodology, the scientific methodology. What would I see if I only saw what can be measured? And then I cannot see beauty. I cannot see ethics. So the bet machine is not far from l'homme machine or man machine. But then the 17th century says, yes, this is the way it is. Only what we can measure exists. But this is Jonas's idea, pan-mechanism. The circle is not there at all. We're basically seeing everything that's dead. And in our secondary school textbooks of biology, we try to define life as a sort of strange anomaly in a universe that is completely dead. Everything is dead. The whole landscape is a big machine, and the whole universe can be considered as a big metronome, something that's mechanical, something that is based on the laws of mechanics. And here again is the l'homme machine. Man seen as something, as merely an assembly of atoms. Well, yes, okay. Pan-mechanism sees man as only atoms and emptiness. So here we should start thinking about beauty. I'm a biologist by profession, and I'm really interested in evolution biology. And of course, biology cannot use or work with the concept of beauty because you can't measure it. But we can say one interesting and important thing, and that is that the amount of beauty in universe goes up. The universe is beautiful, but evolution does not require the beauty. Evolution could exist without the beauty. And because I'm talking to architects and landscape architects, I've been to Auschwitz 17 times, and I go there every year with our medicine students. And at one point, I realized that this should be a compulsory excursion for all students of art, sculpture, etc. Trying to make something that's utilistic without a pinch of beauty. Normally, you try to build a house so that it serves its purpose, so it's nice to live in, so that you don't have to walk far to go to the bathroom. But here, you can see architecture that has one single objective: to be as bad for people as possible, to deprive people of privacy, to be cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and especially to lack beauty. And at that point, we realize that the beauty of the universe is something that we perceive, but the universe does not have to be like that. You could suggest that we, as people, have evolutionary experience of beauty, but all of a sudden we start seeing more new things as beautiful, like the Hubble telescope and what you can see through it, like photographs from the surface of Mars. And here we realize the wild beauty, the aesthetics of that new views. So we see the world as a botanical garden with all those orchids, etc. But our story, the story of our planet Earth, is more interesting than that, and more interesting than fantasy landscapes. Here you can see the insides of cells, photographs Of course, we do not have to to understand cytology. Of course, we think when we see that there is some coloring used that wasn't there at the beginning, but we realize the aesthetics of this. So the amount of beauty in universe goes up and up again because through evolution, organisms become more and more complicated. And they tend towards not only more complexity, but also more beauty. Imagine first the small organisms, then the dinosaurs, then the mammals, and so on and so forth. And we have a special sense for it. For example, when we go on holiday, we give a lot of money and time to going to virgin nature, to pristine natural environments. Archaeologists would tell us that all old temples, here you can see a model of the Israeli temple from the times of King Herod. And those temples always represented a model of the universe where timelessness meets time and where gods have their seat. And if we turn Herod's temple by 90 degrees, here this is the symbol of the earth, and here up the heaven. In every Christian temple it is like this. There are stars on the ceiling, or the sky in the ceiling, and the earth symbolizes the earth. So every Christian church is basically a model of the universe. And to finish the thought about nature, it is always seen as a huge work of art. St. Augustine says there are two books that will help you know God. First is the Bible, and the second is nature itself. And the advantage is that it is free of charge and you don't have to be literate to read in it. So look at nature, and through nature you can contemplate God through the beauty of the nature. Bernard from Clairvaux said something similar. He was not just a simple priest, he was a learned man. And he said, in trees, in the forests and in trees, you can teach what no teacher can teach you. You can learn what no teacher can teach you. So, of course, trees are a source, a material that you can use to build your houses, etc. But at the same time, they will teach you about beauty and take you to heaven. And quite a peculiar idea coming from the Jewish faith. People basically act through the landscape. The landscape is the mirror of one's soul, like architecture mirrors one's soul. And in the Hebrew Bible, a lot of thoughts like this are present. This is said on many places. For example, the first sin. Because of you, says Adam to Eve, the land is now lost. And you can find a lot of citations like that to the same effect. The first sin is not only between me and God, but also between me and the landscape. But my saint character raises the whole network of relationships toward God. The whole of the land or of earth becomes godly. Very often, saints have their animals that accompany them, like St. Anthony, etc. So those are people who live or have a good relationship with themselves and with God, experience a little bit of that unity of paradise. In current Europe, I think a new phenomenon is arising. The phenomenon of pilgrimages. Remember Santiago of Compostela, and since 1990 approximately, the number of pilgrims has been rising to Santiago. In the last year before COVID, in 2019, it was 347 and something. And is this the atheist Europe that we are talking about? I think no. People are actually in search of spirituality. Perhaps they refuse organized religions, but perhaps they pray alone in nature. And nature is becoming their route to God. So through the beauty of nature, again, they start to see something bigger. And perhaps the last thought, Mr. Berry says that health has the meaning of heal, whole, and holy. And his basic concept is that you can't be healthy in a toxic body, living in a toxic family, in a toxic nation, on a toxic planet. So you can't be healthy when nature is not healthy. Whole health also means holiness and wholesomeness. And I think the same connections between meanings can be made in French. So it's not like us, then something that divides us from nature that should be protected. We are connected. And if we have to conserve nature, it's for utilitaristic reasons, because we are part of it. And if nature does not survive, we cannot survive either. So the land gives us food, but at the same time, it is something beautiful that helps you to contemplate the beauty of God. Through the beauty of the picture, you look at the beauty of the artist. And the Christian and Jewish approach shows that the right way is not pantheism on the one hand, neither pure utilitarianism on the other side. It's something in between. Nature is something that has been given to us as a gift. In our landscape, the nature we live in is not a scene where our economic activities are taking place, or a playground where our economic activities takes place. It is a shrine. And we should behave in nature as we would behave in a shrine.
Thank you very much. That was Marek Vácha and the first lecture of this conference. The next topic is planning for crisis, and it's time to welcome Richard Weller, Australian landscape architect and academic, professor and chair of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning, Mr. Weller.
So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's early in the morning here, and I, just by way of brief introduction, I've spent over 30 years now in my career, both in the academy and in professional practice, trying to personally avoid being part of prostituting design services to the kind of imagery that you see on your screen right now. And that's been a critical and an artistic project and a theoretical project, and it's related to my teaching and my practice and my very being. And the way in which I've done that is through a series of projects and writing, and across a whole range of scales. And what I would like to present to you today is really the most recent phase of that work, which is the last 8 years of work here at Penn that I've been focusing on. And that concerns the relationship between conservation and urbanization. And the research question has been, how can design and design culture be more involved in the intersection of conservation at a planetary scale on the one hand, and the dynamic forces of urbanization on the other? Because we live in the age of urbanization, and we will continue to urbanize for most of the 21st century. And that interest is best summarized by the two worlds that you see on the screen in this next image. these images are accurate in terms of the scale of the planet. On the left, what you see is the infrastructure of civilization, so-called, the mesh of road, rail, telecommunications, and the bright lights of the cities, all networked into one organism, one form of planetary intelligence, which is a remarkable evolutionary development. And the very same world in the other image, the image on the right, we've deleted all of the land and all of the urbanization, and we've just left the protected areas, the so-called protected areas, under the auspices of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So on the image on the left, if you like, is an image of what we used to refer to as culture, and the image on the right is that of what we used to refer to as nature. And the point of this brief lecture and the point of my work over the last 8 years has been to try and bring these two worlds together, because they operate as different cultures and with different languages and different professions, and it plays out spatially that you get the creation of two worlds. On the one hand, an urban world, and on the other hand, a world of fortress conservation. Now, culture's success with the image on the left has been that it has completely colonised the planet. So that is a remarkable evolutionary achievement. But the problem is that for any species which colonises its habitat so completely, evolution teaches that that can also lead to its demise. In other words, the environmental feedback we are now getting at a species level from climate change is basically telling us that unless we reorganise that mesh, that system that has colonised the entire planet, and render it symbiotic with the earth rather than parasitical, could be the end of us, and in this case, the end of lots of other species as well. So it's the stakes are really high in this, the 21st century. There is no more land left to colonise. There are no more planets for us to colonise. So the challenge is not just to green our cities. You know, the design is caught up in processes of greenwashing everything. The real challenge is to reorganise at a structural level that mesh of civilization that has colonised the entire planet. And there are two big pressures on that. The first pressure is that we will continue to urbanise for the rest of this century. I mean, because of increasing population and because of a continual movement of people from rural landscapes into urban landscapes. And so if it's probable that global population will reach 10 billion or 11 billion people by the end of the century, to house those people in urban environments, we will need to build 370, just to get to 10 billion living in urban environments, we will need to build 370 new New York cities this century. That's one New York City about every 4 years. So that's the pace of what's happening. And it's not just building, buildings to house people, it's feeding people and then finding the energy and the water and all the resources, but in particular the food. If 10 billion people consumed food at the level that today's average American does or average European, we would need 93% of the Earth's terrestrial surface to be agriculture. So that also puts enormous pressure on the world's landscapes. So the only good thing about this, I think, is that the process of urbanisation does tend to lead to stable population, or at least it slows population growth down. So eventually, sometime in the 22nd century, you will have an urbanised planet with a stable population and probably a decreasing population. The death rate will go up, but the birth rate will drop significantly because people are living in urban environments, assuming they have access to services. So the key characteristic of the image that you see there is obvious, right? It's about connectivity. Everything that humanity has created is connected into one extraordinary mesh-like system. But that connectivity, the fact that we can be speaking together now from the other side of the world, the fact that we can move products anywhere at any time, this extraordinary cultural ecology, the problem with it has been that it has been at the expense of everything else. And that's why in the image on the right, the global conservation estate, you see it as a fragmented archipelago of isolated islands, effectively. Now, so turning to that world, the other world, the world of conservation, or the world of fortress conservation, the biology of the Earth is expressed in a way through these places that are protected. And protected areas, this is a long story beginning in the middle of the 21st century, but it has its roots in national parks, and it has even deeper roots back to the way we managed lands in the Middle Ages, the way in which the Greeks set aside land as sacred, and so on and so forth. But the point here is that these fragments of land have the global conservation estate is a remarkable achievement over the last 70 years. It began really in 1962 or in the early 60s, when there was only about 9,000 protected areas in the world. And it's since become over 260,000 of these places that are protected in some form. It now constitutes 15.6% of the Earth's terrestrial and marine ocean surface. So it's an extraordinary amount of land. And it's not without its critics, because Indigenous peoples have been evicted from these lands. The whole notion of fortress conservation, which is a pejorative term, it's pejorative because fortress conservation implies that, or plays into, a dualistic worldview where you have protected areas on the one hand, so-called nature, and then you have culture somewhere else, i.e. culture as urbanisation happening somewhere else. So it reinforces a dualistic worldview, which is profoundly problematic philosophically for where we are now in terms of trying to create a more symbiotic world. Now, the real problem for the image on the right, the global conservation estate, is precisely the fact that these pieces of fortress conservation are isolated. As climate change continues, the species of plants and animals and microbes and everything that is protected, or rather trapped in these isolated fragments, will die, in the sense that they cannot move. They cannot migrate and adjust to the pressures of climate change. So the key issue for conservation now is to try and create connectivity. That's the key word, and that'll come up through the rest of the lecture a few times. In other words, we're trying to create connectivity for the world of conservation, the way in which we have connectivity for the world of culture. And so my position has been that the design has to try and these two antithetical worlds, the worlds of design and development, and the worlds of conservation and kind of resisting development, are antithetical. And the only way forward is some kind of reconciliation between these two worlds. And therefore, you need to come at the problem from both sides, from the urban design side of things, the urban planning side of things, which understands how cities work and how they're made and how they're designed and put together. But you also need to come at the problem from the conservation side, with a deep and profound respect for the way in which the natural world works and its survival. These two worlds need each other. They will not endure without each other. So how has this shaped my research and my practice over the last 8 years? That's what the next few slides concern. At the moment, as I said, 15.4% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. I'm not talking about the oceans now, just the land. My preoccupation is with the land. the 2020 target, all of this is administered under the Convention on Biological Diversity, of which the Czech Republic is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, so are another 195 other countries. And this has been the United Nations, overarching document. And the target was that we would reach 17% protected area by 2020. We did not reach that target. We made it to about 15.4%. And so the question now for the conservation community is, well, what should the new targets be? And there's talk about 30-30. In other words, by 2030, we should reach 30% protected area. So ramping it up from 20% to 30%. That's a big deal. That's a lot of land. That may happen. There's a lot of enthusiasm for that being something that will guide as a policy setting the next 10 years of the struggle and the environmental movement and the science and so on. E.O. Wilson, the great North American biologist, talks about half the world, 50%. He argues that we need to give 50% of the planet back to other species if we are to reach some kind of reconciliation between the forces of culture and the forces of nature. So you think, okay, the current aim is 17%. That still exists. That's what all the nations of the world have signed up to. And if we're at 15.4% now, then there's not much to do, right? It's only 1.6%. But when you calculate it, 1.6% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is close to 700,000 central parks. So the research question that I've been asking is, where should those 700,000 central parks be? Where in the world should you locate that land? And what would its form be? Because it's, in terms of connectivity, if we need to achieve connectivity and open up pathways for species to migrate with respect to climate change, so they can move out of the archipelago of fortress conservation into a planetary mesh of pathways that enable species to migrate, which means, by the way, changing land use on a planetary scale. So it's a massive design challenge. If we used just this extra 1.4% of land that we're talking about to reach the 2020 targets of 17%, those 700,000 central parks, if you put them end to end, would go around the Earth about 70 times. So it's a fantastic resource. It seems like only a little thing, but it's actually a really big thing. And my research has concerned the question of, well, that I see that as a design problem and a planning problem. So how do you then proceed to make this into a project? And to answer the question of where this land should be, as a priority, my answer has been that it should be allocated to the world's biological hotspots. Now, that's just common sense, because the scientific community generally agrees that these areas that you see in brown or reddish brown on this map, they are the most valuable biological areas of the planet at the moment. I mean, what a library is to a city, or what libraries are to culture, these repositories of ideas and history and everything that humanity stands for, we put it in libraries. In terms of the way in which the biological world works, the biological world does it through genetics, and those genetics tend to be in these landscapes that you see highlighted on this map. So in other words, if we wanted to meet the 2020 target of 17% protected area for the world, we could now fence off a large forest in Siberia and we could say we're finished, we're done. But that's not the point, because that's not representative of the world's biodiversity. That has very little biodiversity. If you want to save biodiversity, which is the world's genetic inheritance and its creativity, you need to do it in these key biodiversity areas, otherwise known as hotspots shown on this map. So my work is focused on these territories. And the first thing we did was conduct an audit, right? A simple GIS analysis of all of this land, which we were surprised that nobody had done this. And this goes to the question of representation. Representation in terms of conservation means are the protected areas representative of the world's biodiversity? And the answer is no. That archipelago that I began this lecture with, of all the fragments, is the result of ad hoc political, economic opportunism. It hasn't been a rational process where somebody sat back, sort of godlike, and said, well, we should protect these areas, and these areas. It was not a rational, coordinated project. It's been a series of desperate attempts by the conservation movement to salvage territory from exploitation. So the question now is one of representation. How do we set aside more protected areas that actually represent the world's biodiversity? And that is something that comes down to the scale of the hotspots, as you see on this map, but it goes down to another scale of ecoregions, of which there are over 850 that constitute the Earth. And in an ideal world, 17% at least of each of those 850 ecoregions should be protected. And it should not just be protected, it should be connected as one planetary system. So we're a long way from that, because what you see on this map shows you, just with regard to the hotspots, only the green areas have met the 17% target. So only the green areas on this map of the world have satisfied the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity 2020 target of reaching 17% protected area. All of the reddish-brown areas have not. So our argument was, well, you should focus investment and planning on those areas that have not yet met the target. And we did that, as I said, by conducting an audit, and it looks like this. This is a big project, several years, titled the Atlas for the End of the World. It exists as a website that you can visit if you're interested. But you see here, for example, this is the Indo-Burma hotspot, and it only, at the moment, well, as of a couple of years ago, it had only reached 13.4% protected area. So that those nations, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and a little bit of China, have some work to do if they want to satisfy the agreement that they are signatory to under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. They need to set aside collectively another 4% or so of their territory. So again, that's a planning issue and a design opportunity. That's how I see it. Now, I'm not an expert at it, but I don't know anything about the Czech Republic with regard to conservation and urbanisation as it is currently, but I did have a very quick look at it just as a matter of curiosity because I was talking today. And it seems to me from the last report that you submitted to the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries that are signatory to the convention have to submit reports every 5 years. They're called National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plans, and you've submitted your 6th plan. The Czech Republic is around 22% protected. So you're well over the 17% target. So you can kind of say, well, we're done, we're good. But that's not the case, because it's not just a question of targets and quantity. It's a question of quality. And, you know, what is the, but it seems to me, at least, just by looking at it, just this simple plan image of the Czech Republic does indicate it's actually a kind of an ideal version of habitat structure, because you have several very large patches, which is very important for the gene pool. But then you can see the kind of sinews or lines of what is potentially connectivity, which I presume is riparian corridors, you know, drainage lines, rivers and so on. So it looks like the Czech Republic, from a conservation perspective, is kind of an ideal world, potentially. I mean, I don't know what's actually happening on the ground, but I just say that because it's interesting as an image. Excuse me. So the other piece of this, as I said, is urbanisation. So we also looked at what's happening with cities and how they're behaving in the world's biological hotspots. And this is the image that should really frighten you. This is an analysis of the growth of cities in the world's biological hotspots. And we looked at about 422 cities. A city is defined by the United Nations as 300,000 people or more. So there's a whole bunch of cities that are under 300,000 people. That is also something we could look at. But we just said, okay, we'll look at cities from 300,000 people or bigger. every single yellow dot that you see on this map indicates a city that is growing rapidly, and not just growing into empty space, but growing, sprawling directly up against habitat that harbours endangered species. So each one of these yellow dots represents a collision course between rapid urbanisation projected out to 2050, right? We looked at each city and projected its growth out to the middle of the century. And when you superimpose that mapping on the mapping of endangered species, you see all the conflict. So that's a problem, because this is not being, the global planning and design community is not working in these territories. It's not concerned with this issue. Design always follows the money. The design is always working in rich first world cities instead of these parts of the world where this calamity is occurring. You can't work with 422 cities, so we reduced the sample set to a set of 32, and you see those marked in the red dots on this map. These are the biggest and the fastest growing cities, effectively the capital cities of the world's biological hotspots. And so we've been working with those cities and conducting case studies on different cities. And in those case studies, we're taking it down to a design and a planning level and trying to show how conservation values and urban design values can coexist. And the only way you can do that is through the creativity of design. It has to be a design, ultimately it's a design problem. It can't just be words and images and reports. Designers have to show how this can actually happen. So there's the 32 cities. Everywhere where you see red on these maps indicates direct conflict between urban growth and biodiversity. This is Bogota, for example. You can see Bogota is currently a city of 9 million people. It will grow to about 15 million people by 2050. And the red areas that you see around Bogota are all of the areas of conflict between endangered species and future urban growth. So we work on designs to show how, you see here on the right, an urban plan for the growth of the city. The city has to grow, another 5 million people. A second airport, the flower industry, transport systems. But then through that, and that urbanism is correlated to an ecological plan, which emphasises connectivity, protecting riparian corridors, wetlands, and so on. So a whole lot of ecological values. And then the two have to compromise and somehow mesh together. So that's the I won't talk too much about that. We don't have time. So there's a plan, a synthesized plan for what I was saying about the two worlds becoming symbiotic, the conservation world and the urbanization world, can be here demonstrated at the level of a whole city. And that's a project designed to resist the sprawl of Bogota, for example, destroying its own habitat in the process. Now, connectivity is the final thing I wanted to talk about. You can see now I've flattened that image out and you see all the protected areas. You can see what it's just it's an archipelago of isolated fragments. And as I said, the species that are trapped in these protected areas cannot migrate and adjust to climate change. So we have to open up pathways and achieve connectivity between all these fragments, which means reorganizing land use on a planetary scale. This is not me just saying this. This is the policy of the UN under the auspices of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the key planning question is, how do we open up connectivity and achieve connectivity for species other than humans? And it is actually happening. This is the exciting and I think the optimistic part of this. Governments, communities, and the scientific community are working together, and the investment community also. I mean, there's a lot of money in this. People are working together to try, and it's almost as if for the first time in history, for the first time in urbanized history, humans are once again, as they did when we were indigenous people, treating the world as a garden, and a world that has to be worked and maintained and cared for. And in this case, it's about these massive reconstruction projects, ecological restoration projects, which are aimed at achieving connectivity to enable species migration. Each of these, there's about 200 of these projects going on in the world right now. And I find that profoundly optimistic. But I want to make a point. You see up the top, I've written people. The World Bank at the moment is referring to these as nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions. It sounds great because it's nature. Everyone loves nature, but also everyone loves a solution. So it's like, wow, it's going to fix all our problems. And I've crossed that out because I don't think that's the right expression. Nature has too much historical baggage, and solution. They're not solutions, they're experiments. These are actually landscape experiments, and we don't know much about what we're doing. We have everything to learn about. This is a whole new development in terms of design culture and the natural sciences and so on. We are starting to, it's like a new breed of mega project. What the mega project was to the 20th century, many of which failed, right? This is a new kind of green infrastructural mega project. So I think it's better to call these mega eco projects because that keeps them, I think makes it more critical. It keeps these projects within the body of knowledge that we know about mega projects from the 20th century, many of which had many problems. And I think there'll be problems with these new projects, these new green infrastructure projects, because we don't know what we're doing. We always do it before we really know what we're doing. We have to learn as we do it. But nonetheless, I think it's really exciting that this is happening. And so my current research is really concerned with this set of mega eco projects and trying to understand their dynamics. I'll finish now with a pet project which is about connectivity. This is my own mega eco project, if you like, that I've been doing with students here at Penn for over the last 5 years. And it's called the World Park Project, and it's pretty simple. This is now UNESCO and I are starting to work together, and this project has moved from just being a big idea into a feasibility phase where we're analysing its feasibility because the idea is so big and complicated that it seems impossible that it would happen. But it's just like everything else that humans have done in terms of urbanising the entire planet. It's just a connectivity project at a planetary scale. It's actually not that hard if governments wanted to do it and if people wanted to do it. So the idea is, firstly, to achieve connectivity. And if you approach this like a designer, how would you achieve connectivity so that most of those biological hotspots are connected? Well, you'd simply do it like this. You'd draw one line there. You'd draw another line there. So the first line from Alaska down to Patagonia, this second one from the southern tip of from Namibia right up through Central Africa up into southern Turkey, and then you would do another one from here, from the southern tip of Australia right through Central Asia across to Morocco. Now that does those 3 lines do a lot of work for you. They don't pick up all the hotspots, but they pick up many of them. And the idea there is that, you can see, I've written it here, those 3 lines pick up 19 hotspots, involve 55 nations and stitch together over 160,000 kilometres of territory. And the idea is that these 3 lines are simply walking trails, right? You could simply walk those red lines. So that's a small investment to build walking trails. It's still a lot of money, right, of course, but it's nothing to build walking trails and camping sites and the infrastructure so that people can leave cities and literally walk the world. This would take 2 years to walk this trail, 3 years to walk this trail. It's faster if you were to ride a bike, for example, but whatever. So the idea is that the trails are the catalysts for creating the world park. And so in the first instance, this is just about walking, which is beautiful. It's a poetic and important pastime that entices people out into landscapes of reverie and contemplation. But and I've written there in Latin, solvitur ambulando, meaning walking solves all our problems, right? So it's a beautiful thing to do. But it gets more serious because the idea is that people don't just, not just rich kids from the first world who want a year off university go for a long walk. This has to be about work. Not just walking, but working. And by that I mean, the idea of this is to entice, to pull people out into these remote landscapes and to not just keep walking, but to stop and work on landscape restoration projects all the way along these trails. And it's that work that constitutes the mission of the idea of creating a world park. So the way it works is this. On this map, you can see the yellow areas that you see there are existing protected areas. The red line is the walking trail that comes through and stitches together, links those protected areas. But then the hatched black line work is all of the landscape restoration work that is necessary to create connectivity between the existing fragments of what I referred to earlier as fortress conservation. So this is about opening up the world and working on landscape restoration to try and create landscape connectivity at a planetary scale. That's what the World Park is all about. So, this is the first trail, which we call the Pataska, from Alaska to Patagonia. Here is the second, which we call the Taribia, from Namibia into Turkey. And here is the third, from Australia to Morocco, which we call the Ozrock. And as I said, we are now moving these projects, the analysis of this into a feasibility study with the support of UNESCO. You can visit the website and see all the maps. They look like this. We've done we've mapped it in considerable detail. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now. I think I'm already over time. I just wanted to make a final point about what's happening in design culture, both I think in Europe and here in the United States. The environmental movement has been largely a single issue movement, the environment, for the last 70 years or so. What's happening now under the expression or the aegis of the Green New Deal is that environmental values...
Last few minutes.
Yes, I'm finishing now. The environmental movement is being connected with issues of social justice, equity, and with decarbonisation. And that makes everything more complicated, but I think it makes it also more compelling. So in the politics of that and the philosophy of that, the Green New Deal in Europe, which is pushing for decarbonisation, the Green New Deal in the United States, trying to triangulate equity, decarbonisation and environmental values, I see that as a design problem. And design has to be at the centre of that. It's not just a political problem. It's not a return to socialism and all of just political policies and polemic. It has to be a creative project that designers are involved with so that it becomes spatialised. And that's not easy, but I think that's the project going forward. So I hope I've shown you some things that you find interesting and inspirational, and I'll be happy to take questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. Thank you.
Thank you to you for that amazing lecture. I think it was very inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So that was Richard Weller, landscape architect and professor from University of Pennsylvania. You will meet him during the discussion. And now it's time for Marek Kundrata, my colleague from Institute of Planning. He's from Office of Public Space. Welcome here, Marek.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the super interesting presentation, and I think I will be really in a micro scale if I compare to your lecture, even though I thought it's quite large scale. So thank you for thank you for putting me down a little bit. And here we go. This is an image from this morning, from this cold morning, and you see a beautiful Prague that is based on the Moldau River. And this is also Prague. This is the same river, just a few meters from us. We are next to the Troja castle. You can see almost on the right of the image the same castle from the other side. It's the same river, but of course you can see how it looks today. The Prague landscape is really interesting thanks to its topography, because it has a valley, it has side streams that have cut it through the landscape, and the upper plains that have been just in the recent decades that have been urbanized. So again, the topography says that the Prague is and was based on the river, as many other cities through the history. This is image Prague castle above. Just before there was a Charles Bridge. We see a wooden bridge. Before that, the river was crossed by a fort. And the river for Prague is not only about the beautiful scenery, but it's also it's also a threat. We saw it in 2002 with large floods. Imagine 6 or 7 meters above you, the mass of the water. Again, 2013, the floods came again, even though Prague was preparing for it. It came from a different way. It came from the streams on the side. So Prague was flooded again. It's also a potential and a benefit within the cooling of Prague. It's also an infrastructure, boats, motorways, but also paths, as Richard was talking about, even though in some parts that they are so crowded that local people are afraid of going all the way to the river. So it's also causing problems. The governance is a topic for us. I will talk a little bit more later. But you can see with the red, some parts owned by the state, some owned by the city. Of course, within the state and within the city, many organizations that are responsible for the governance. We've been looking in good examples. I will just show one that is inspiring for us. This is Isar River in Munich. You can see the history, the river and its wilderness, then the channelization in 18th and 19th century, and then the famous revitalization on the right that looks really tiny if you compare it to the history, but it is a big success, and we hope for also successful projects like this in Prague. In 2014, when the IPR was established and the Office of Public Space was established, we came with the Prague Riverfront concept, which is a document that was a first step for calling the city, calling the river and the riverbanks the city important public space. It looked to the river more from the perspective of public spaces than from the perspective of nature, even though it initiated several projects in the center, in the downtown of Prague, but also the landscape projects in the north and the south I would talk about later. You can see on this map several projects. There are more than 30 projects, quite large-scale projects running at the moment in Prague, just next to the river, and they all are running without further coordinating body that is somewhere above them. Here's an example from the north. You in the morning, in the beginning of the presentation, you just saw the picture from here with the parking place, not very nice looking. And this is the Troja Basin, where IPR in 2015 was asked to bring a conception, landscape conception for this area because of the extension of the wastewater treatment plant. This is one of the most interesting and most environmentally valuable areas in Prague, where you can really see the river and the floodplain. The conception created many principles, but also divided the space for smaller projects with the action plan that was accompanied not only with the project phases, but also with the pilot governance of the area that was agreed within the stakeholders. And I would like to just show quickly one project that is maybe complex and can show our approach. This is called Wild Moldau project, that is focusing on water flood protection, which is helping the Prague to prevent the floods. We are extending the water body, and because the Vltava River is one of the, in this area, it is one of the narrowest places in Prague. It actually has an effect not only locally, but this extension has an effect all the way to the center of Prague, as the flood models are saying. Here is an image that shows the new redesign of the floodplain, accompanied with the streams and flood park facing the Troy Chateau I was telling about, and a new semi-natural islands in the area. Another project that I would briefly speak about is a Rohan Island. It is a large area, about 50 hectares in the more central part of the Prague, and it is important because it is also not only serving biodiversity, it is not only serving the inhabitants, but it has also a flood protection elements, because it again brings more place to the water. And we are currently now preparing a competition for this area. So if practicing landscape architects are watching, so please follow IPR in the sometime in the spring next year. We would announce a competition for this area. And of course, the public involvement is important in all of the projects, also Rohan Island. One project from the center with that you can see that it's not only about the natural areas. We are working on the revitalization of the central riverbanks in Prague, and now we are coming all the way to the south, where the confluence of Moldau River and Berounka River is. It's a really large area, about 1,300 hectares, that is mostly in the private hands, but this project is more about the governance and the coordination than about large-scale projects. They are there, but the city role is kind of a moderating and trying to push forward the smaller scale projects there. It's also from the picture from the confluence, and the approach trying to moderate the change of the landscape from more intensive agriculture land more towards biodiversity and different uses of the area concerning the ecosystem services that are there. So just before this presentation, with my colleague, we have tried to count a little bit of all the projects. What are they bringing to Prague? It's about 60 kilometers of new and reconstructed pedestrian and bike paths. It's about 140 new and revitalized parks and natural areas. And it's about 80 hectares of new water bodies and revitalized floodplains. So I was a bit surprised of how much we have without any coordination, without any larger coordinating body that is taking care of these smaller scale projects. No program that a city is running to help the river in the general. So the question is, what's next? Maybe I hope that this conference will also give us some light of next steps, what Prague needs and what could follow. But definitely we need some kind of governance that between the state, the city, and many other local stakeholders. And also another step is to educate us as a city, but also to educate the inhabitants, educate the tourists, the visitors, because the river has its values, and we need to show them to be able to protect it and to invest. So thank you very much, and I hope maybe next time we meet in person and we can have a tour on the river at some sunny day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marek. Now it's time for a short discussion that will be held by my colleague Martina. And please welcome Jana Pišková, landscape architect. Welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning, Jana, and please join the discussion.
Thanks once again to all the speakers for very interesting presentations. I think that we started at the very large scale of the whole universe. Then we went only to our planet Earth, and we ended up with really so-called detailed, such as Prague is. So because I know that, Richard, you have to go soon, so my first question is for you, and I would like to ask, how do you communicate this issue, and to whom? Because we are talking about the whole planet. So how does it work, please?
Thank you for the question. The communication challenge for a project like this, I don't really know the answer, but I've been trying to work it out because it is such a big project. And it's been one of the interesting things to ask the question, how do you advance a project at such a scale? And you think it's impossible, but then you realise that it's actually just the way in which many existing organisations do work. There are many structures in the NGOs that work at a planetary scale. It's perfectly normal for businesses to work at this scale. As I mentioned, so for example, the World Bank works at this scale, not always for good outcomes, but so what I'm saying, the philanthropic organisations also work at this scale. And the conservation movement works at this scale. So it's kind of like you realise that it's designers that don't work at this scale, because designers are caught up in the process of development, and which is connected to sites and projects. So they're stuck at the project scale. So I've been trying to communicate to the NGOs and to the philanthropic community and to the conservation community, as opposed to the normal places where design is communicated. And I'm starting to get a little bit of traction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I totally agree that our problem is that we are very connected to the site and to some boundaries, but landscape is right everywhere. So sometimes not respecting the boundaries may be better for us, right?
Right.
Yeah, I have another question from the audience, again, Richard, for you, and it's from Magdalena, and she's asking, can we personally in any way contribute and help to connectivity projects?
Well, I'm not sure. It's a very general question. I mean, there's a really good example of a connectivity project called the Y2Y, which is, it's 2,000 miles of territory from Canada down into the United States, from the Yukon to Yellowstone. And it's a real project. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because it shows how hard it is. Like, it's been a 20-year project for a group of really passionate people who live in that part of the world and have really devoted their lives to trying to achieve connectivity, because it involves so much negotiation to cross so many boundaries. Because with connectivity, you're always working in someone else's territory. And so you're always working in hostile territory and trying to reconcile different interest groups. To answer the question of how you can get involved, I don't know. I don't know at what scale you want to get involved. You can become part of conservation movements who do work on connectivity, or you could work locally on connectivity. But it's also important to remember that connectivity and the way ecology works and what's important for particular species is that you work from a very big scale down to a very small scale. Those scales are connected. So when we talk about connectivity, it doesn't mean just drawing great big lines all over the Earth, the planet. It's actually a much finer operation that moves across different scales. And I think to answer the question, you can work on any project, if you start to see it as a question of connectivity rather than just a bounded site for a piece of development, it opens up the world for you. It changes the way you design places. I'm not sure that's answered the question, but anyway, it's a response.
I believe you answered it for me, so hopefully for Magdalena as well. And then I have the last question from the audience, and then we can move on to our questions, to our discussion. It's from Mary, and she's asking if you can recommend any research, literature, or book about connectivity.
Look, the easiest way to answer that is for you to send me an email, and I'll be happy to correspond with you, and I can give you some good references regarding connectivity.
Okay.
Because it is an established area in the sciences, less so in design, but in planning. But it is also there is a body of literature about connectivity with regard to design and planning that I can refer you to. That would be the simplest thing, rather than go through it now.
Okay. We'll do that. We'll do that.
Yeah.
I have a question also for our other panelists. Marek, you are working for an institution. Jana, you are the head of the NGO for landscape architecture. We started with the communication problem. How do you, from your experience, from your practice, perceive this communication issue? How do you communicate the issues from your practice, and with who?
We have a special office of our colleagues that is responsible for the communication of the projects. And in most of the projects, we have quite a similar process of participation. First, we are trying to gather some information, involve it in the projects, and then show it to the public, have some feedback. We used to do it physically, mostly in the space. Now, in recent years, we are moving more to the digital, or combining these two ways. And then, of course, at the end, there is some kind of conference or some kind of exhibition or event we are trying to do. In one of the pictures, you saw exhibition in the Rohan Island, which was a very successful exhibition because it was very interactive. There were some games for the kids and some events for the adults. So it's a combination but it's also a problem that in our ways some of the projects are very, very important, but they could be at the outskirts of Prague, for example, and they lack of the media attention and of the attention of the locals, because there are just very, very few people living there. But it's an issue for the citywide perspective. So for these kind of large-scale strategic projects, or the projects that are a little bit behind, we still don't have, or we are not able to use efficiently the communication tools we have now. So I would be happy if someone can help us with that.
So Richard, you will receive another email from Marek asking for the tools. And Jana, what is your experience?
I'm thinking about this persuading people and how to spread the information and persuade people how the situation, how serious is the situation in today's world. And there are two levels. One is that our NGO, together with Chamber of the Architects and other professionals, are trying to comment, for example, legislative changes and so on. But they are, let's say, critical steps. But what I feel is a big problem, and I think it is not only in Czech Republic, that we are preaching to the converted. We are talking in our circles where we feel the problem very serious and so on, but we are together with biologists and ecologists, landscape architects, and some enlightened urban planners, like, for example, your institute and so on. But I'm looking for an answer how to reach and how to talk to the politicians, how to talk to the wealthy people, to persuade them to become philanthropists for saving the world in our country and so on, and push to the politicians and so on, because I feel that in our country these problems are solved and trying to be solved by NGOs, public and specialists, but it is not taken seriously by the government and local politicians. And I even think that this great conference is not followed by the Prague politicians. I doubt that they are sitting at their computers and watching the screens. And this is the problem. And we need to find a way how to target them.
A lot was said about things having their prices. Do you all think that people finally understand that this is about our survival and not about us making more money?
I think they don't trust it. They don't trust to the scientists, and they feel like it is not so serious.
And Richard, from American perspective, what do you think?
Well, America is a disaster in many ways. It's now reached a point where it's ungovernable, and so it's a very complicated and chaotic situation. But what does work here is that individuals or groups of people, firstly, they do still have a belief that they can mobilize an idea, and they can express an idea, and they will find an audience. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain level of positivity. So if you have an idea and you want to do a series of projects, for example, as we've seen with these particular projects around Prague, I think there's still a culture in the United States that says yes before it says no, you know? So there is a receptive audience there, but you have to be smart about the way you package what you're trying to sell. And it is a kind of salesman role. The thing about the politicians, of course, the politicians are corrupt and stupid, so we all know that. But we need to appeal to their vanity. And I mean, it's not good enough for a new generation of designers to say, oh, no one's listening to us, we can't do anything. We do have a lot of communication tools, and I think you've got a new generation of people that are extremely angry about the state of the world and want to change things. But I don't think it can just be couched in terms of negativity or criticality. It probably has to be spun a little bit as a positive project. And that's where design is good, because design is generally optimistic. And if a politician can find in design something that appeals to their vanity, then you can get them on board because they can see a win for themselves. There are, I mean, the mayors around the world, the mayors of cities, for example, are very competitive with each other. And they know that design can help them look good. And they want to make their cities, they're competitive to make their cities greener and greener, because they know that if they can make their cities more environmental and have a design culture in their cities, they will attract more smart young people, which they need for the economy. So this is where design, it gets tricky, because design becomes commercial, but it should, in other words, you have to play that game. And there's one example I'd like to mention here that I think is really important. Take the city of Medellin in Colombia. Medellin was the murder capital of the world. You could not get a worse place with more corruption and more crime and more fear than Medellin. And it was turned around. And it was turned around by an enlightened politician with a group of designers, urban designers, landscape architects and planners, who developed ideas for working not with the rich part of town, but working on the poorest parts of town. I mean, that is extraordinary. That designers and politicians said, we're going to invest in the poorest parts of the city, and it worked. Those projects that they did in Medellin in terms of transport, connectivity, public spaces, buildings, transformed what were the most violent communities on the planet into relatively stable, peaceful places. And so I think there's reason to be optimistic. And as I said, design, it's not just criticizing politicians. We can show them something. We can design something and say, well, here's the project. Get on board. If you're not on board, you'll be voted out, and we'll find politicians that are enthusiastic about making a better world.
Okay, so showing good results, good examples, good projects. We have a long way ahead of us. I have one very last question, because then we have to move on. And I think it's addressed to all of you. I'd like to know, what do you think is the right form of urbanism for the 21st century? Who wants to start? Marek, maybe?
Not me, definitely.
Okay, Jana?
I think that we should bear in mind social issues, green infrastructure issues, talk to the technicians and so on, and talk together, because it's one space and we need to squeeze everything together. So it's complex, holistic approach is the only way. And it is not only local, but what I say that the morning traffic jam in Prague starts at the border area, because people need to go to Prague or to the cities because of work, and they can't commute by trains because the train system is very bad and so on. So we need really to work globally in the meaning of the country, or even the neighborhood areas behind the border.
Okay, and Richard, can you give us your opinion?
Well, I think it depends if what we're talking about, the short term or the mid-term or the long term. In some ways, the long term is the easiest, because that allows you to I can answer in a really sort of big way, and it sounds simple, but I think in the long term, we're trying to evolve cities from the phase that cities are currently locked in is very mechanistic. They're machines, and they're fairly crudely engineered machines. In the longer term, the challenge is to try to make cities into more sophisticated ecological organisms that are symbiotic with the earth, as I started in my presentation. And the only way you can do that is not worrying so much about the look of the city, or certainly not greenwashing cities, but it's about the metabolism of the city. So you have to look at you have to ask, where does the energy come from? Where does the water come from? Where does the food come from? And where does the money come from? And when you follow those things out, you have a very different idea of the city. It suddenly becomes, again, a planetary system. And so I think the metabolism has to be designed. Otherwise, we're just putting parsley on the pig or makeup on the body. It has to be structural change, but that's really hard, because modernity has done a really good job of rendering everything invisible. Everything's magic. I flick a switch, I get electricity. I turn on my tap, I get water. I flush my toilet and the shit goes away. I mean, it's wonderful, it's magical, but it's also very dangerous, because it's created a system of which we can't see and we're disconnected from. So we have to open all of those systems up, and all of that is a design challenge. In the shorter term, I think it's a bit like the other answer. I think it is at the project scale, and cities are chaotic and complex and messy. And I think, design has to work on things like the traffic jam in Prague in the morning, for sure. But I have faith that design intelligence can be effective in terms of, so design thinking is so good at dealing with complex situations. I think it's possible to design things in cities in the short term that help cities and don't just gentrify cities. And then I think the longer term challenge is how do we unravel these systems of modernity so that they become more ecological? So there's two answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to finish and move on to another session. So thank you all for being part of this discussion, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much as well.
So, thank you all. And now we have a short coffee break. So I guess we will meet again in 10 or 15 minutes. And we will start with the session 2, which is called Urban and Digital Landscape with Ingo Kovarik and Charlie Klemos. So see you again here in a few minutes. Thank you.